In 1923, a German banker watched 30 years of discipline turn into a joke. He had done almost everything the respectable world says a careful man should do. He owned government bonds. He had a pension. He kept savings at a reputable Berlin bank. He did not gamble. He did not chase fads. He did not live like a fool. And by November of that year, much of what he had built would not buy him a proper cup of coffee. Around the same time, not very far away, a farmer with no polished education, no financial language, and no access to elite institutions found himself in the opposite condition. His fields still grew grain. His grain still fed people. And when the mark began dying in public, bags of flour became more desirable than paper promises. People traded furniture, silver, art, pianos, and family possessions for food. One man had every approved asset. The other man had what the world still needed after approval became worthless. Same country, same crisis, same year, completely different outcome. The thing that separated them was not intelligence. It was not social rank. It was not even timing in the heroic sense. People like to admire. It was what they held. That has been true far longer than people like to admit. I have spent my life studying businesses, currencies, incentives, and the strange ways human beings confuse official safety with actual durability. One of the most useful and unpleasant truths I know is this: the assets people are most proud of holding before a monetary crisis are often the very assets that betray them inside one. A savings account feels safe. A pension feels responsible. A government bond sounds civilized. A fixed monthly income sounds stable. That is exactly why people trust them too far. They mistake being legible to the current system for being protected from the failure of that system. That is a costly misunderstanding. I do not say this because I think the world ends every Tuesday. It does not. I do not say this because I believe every currency collapses in some dramatic weekend. Some do. Many simply decay more slowly and more politely. I say it because the same pattern has repeated often enough across enough centuries, cultures, and monetary regimes that anyone serious about preserving wealth should feel embarrassed not knowing it. Every fiat currency in history has one thing in common. At some point, someone believed it would be different this time. At some point, someone believed the issuing authority was prudent, civilized, modern, too important, too powerful, too sophisticated, or too necessary to let the currency degrade in any serious way. Then the degradation arrived anyway, first as a policy choice, then as a social fact, then as a new normal people pretended they had expected all along. The dollar has already lost more than 96% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created. That is not a sudden collapse. It is the long, respectable version of the same principle. A currency can die loudly, or it can be thinned gradually until only arithmetic. Minded people notice what happened. Either way, the holders of passive paper claims learned the same lesson. The unit changed. Their life did not get cheaper. And that is why I keep returning to a hard question. What survives when the money itself stops being trusted? People often want a neat answer to that, as if there were one asset, one clever position, one magical hedge, one perfect historical recipe. Life is not that convenient, but history is clearer than most people realize again and again across revolutions, inflations, defaults, banking panics, and currency breaks. A familiar group of assets keeps absorbing value while the ordinary paper claims burn. The names change, the wrappers change, the legal language changes, the nature of the survivors does not. If I wanted to explain this to a thoughtful person without drowning him in theory, I would not begin with economics textbooks. I would begin with Rome, not because Rome was the first civilization to debase money, but because people still remember it well enough to hear the lesson. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire steadily reduced the silver content of its coinage. You can call that monetary necessity if you like. Governments usually prefer cleaner words. The practical meaning was simple. The coin kept the official name while losing the substance that gave it purchasing power. Taxes still had to be paid, soldiers still had to be funded, the state still needed resources. So the metal content was stretched and diluted. The coin remained official, its trust did not. And what happened? People with access to real goods, land, harvests, tools, and local productive capacity kept living in the world of actual needs. The person holding a state promise denominated in a weakening unit learned a much crueler lesson. Official value and real value are not the same thing when pressure. That pattern shows up again and again. Revolutionary France printed assignats, supposedly backed by seized church lands. That sounded civilized enough on paper. The problem with paper is that it multiplies more easily than integrity. Within a few years, the assignats had lost the overwhelming majority of their value. The people who exited into hard assets early preserved themselves. Those who remained obedient to the official story preserved only their receipts. Weimar Germany gets attention because the collapse was so visually grotesque. Wheelbarrows of notes, prices changing by the hour, children using stacks of currency as toys. The spectacle is what people remember. I think the more important lesson is subtler. The people destroyed were often the people who had behaved responsibly according to the old rules. Their mistake was not foolishness in the ordinary sense. Their mistake was believing that responsible behavior inside a monetary system necessarily protects you from the failure of the monetary system itself. That is not true. You can be perfectly responsible and still be perfectly ruined if your prudence is concentrated entirely inside a unit that loses public trust. That is why I no longer ask first whether an asset is considered safe under ordinary conditions. I ask what gives it value if the unit of account becomes unreliable. That question is infinitely more useful. It is also more uncomfortable because it forces you to think outside the social default. The social default says a banker should be safer than a farmer. A pensioner should be safer than a butcher. A man with bonds and deposits should be safer than a man with sacks of grain, livestock, tools, and calloused hands. History laughs at these hierarchies when currencies fail. The farmer was not richer because he was spiritually superior. He was richer because he controlled output the currency could not replace. That is the whole secret. When money dies, the world does not stop requiring food, shelter, fuel, transport, medicine, and repair. It only stops valuing the old measuring stick in the same way. The economy does not vanish. It reorders around whatever still solves immediate needs. That is why the first true survivor is productive land. I am not speaking about speculative land bought because someone hopes the county will approve a nicer zoning map one day. I mean productive land that grows food, land that holds water, land that carries timber, minerals, useful access, or some other output independent of any central bank's emotional state. A productive acre is not a theory. It turns sunlight, soil, labor, and season into something other people need, whether the local currency is healthy or dying. This is why farmers in collapsing monetary regimes so often become unexpectedly powerful. In Weimar Germany, they could demand gold, foreign currency, or direct barter. In Zimbabwe, those with productive land and livestock did not become immune to chaos, but they retained bargaining power when urban salary earners found that the number printed on their money no longer resembled value. In every inflationary environment, control over output matters more than elegance on a statement. People sometimes object here and say land is illiquid. That is true, and it misses the point. The question in a currency crisis is not first about tradability on a neat electronic platform. It is about whether the asset produces something the society must still chase after trust in paper weakens. Productive land does. It is not the only answer. It is simply one of the oldest. And it teaches a broader lesson. The market value of an asset under normal conditions is often less important in a crisis than the direct usefulness of the asset outside the monetary framework. That same logic explains why gold survives. Now, I have never been interested in turning gold into religion. I do not think it is a replacement for productive businesses. Over long spans, I prefer assets that generate cash, widen moats, and grow. But if the question is what humans repeatedly reach for when official money breaks, gold deserves respect because it sits in an old part of the human mind that no modern slogan has erased. People accept gold in crises not because of mysticism, but because gold solves several practical problems at once. It is portable. It is recognizable. It is scarce. It is divisible enough for exchange. It is not someone else's liability. Most importantly, a government cannot create more of it with a policy meeting and a press release. That matters immensely when confidence in official money has begun cracking. During the French inflation, gold holders preserved what paper holders lost. In Latin American crises, the same pattern returned. In Russia, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in each case the names and politics changed, but the human response did not. When official money stops working as a trustworthy store of value, people move toward older monetary technologies. They do it quickly, not because they have all read monetary history, but because in stressed systems trust collapses toward what is hardest to fake. That does not mean gold will make you rich in ordinary times. That is not its job. Gold is not usually the thing that turns a good decade into a spectacular one. Its value is more defensive and more psychological. It is what remains recognizable when confidence in the paper world weakens faster than policymakers expected. It is not there to impress your neighbor. It is there so that if your unit of account is degraded politically, you still hold something the political system did not create. That is why central banks themselves keep buying it. I always tell people to watch what institutions do when their rhetoric and their balance sheets disagree. Officially, gold is often treated as old-fashioned. In practice, those same institutions keep accumulating it. That ought to interest you. The third survivor is less dramatic to talk about, and in my mind more beautiful. It is a business with pricing power. This is the place where most people misunderstand me when I talk about crisis assets. They imagine crisis survival must involve things buried in the ground, hidden in safes, or held outside the productive economy. That is incomplete. Some of the most resilient wealth in monetary stress comes from ownership of businesses that can keep passing costs through because the world cannot stop buying what they sell. Not every business has that power. Most do not. A company making discretionary luxury products for overextended consumers is not in the same position as a company selling electricity, staple foods, fuel, medicine, or essential services. In an inflationary break, the business that can reprice quickly and maintain demand may not merely survive. It may get stronger relative to everyone frozen into fixed price promises. Brazil in the 1980s taught this vividly. Inflation ran so fast that supermarket shelves were reportedly repriced multiple times a day. The firms able to turn inventory rapidly and adjust prices in step with currency deterioration preserved real margins far better than those trapped in fixed contracts or slow repricing models. What looked like chaos at street level was, for the right business, a kind of brutal filtration process. The weak structures were crushed. The fast repricers lived. That is why I have always preferred businesses that can ask more and still get it when costs rise. Pricing power is one of the finest assets in all of capitalism. In normal times, it makes you richer slowly. In inflationary times, it keeps you alive while weaker businesses become museums of old prices. When I owned Coke, I was not buying sugar water. I was buying a product people would continue reaching for and a brand that could raise price without requiring a philosophical referendum from the customer. That principle scales beyond beverages. The same logic applies to categories where replacement or abstention is too painful for the buyer. Now, a great many people make a mistake here. They hear the phrase pricing power and think every business that raised prices during one good year must own a durable moat. Nonsense. True pricing power shows itself not just when everyone is flush, but when consumers are under pressure and still cannot or will not abandon the product. That is what makes it a crisis asset. So no, not every stock survives a currency break, but ownership in the right businesses can behave much more like real assets than the public realizes, precisely because the business can keep pulling more nominal currency through the till as the currency itself weakens. The fourth survivor is foreign currency and foreign claims. This one is so obvious once you see it that it becomes almost embarrassing how often people ignore it. If your home currency is the one failing, then holding your entire life in that unit is like insisting on staying in a building while the fire is still politely in the hallway. The people who come through monetary crises best are usually not the people with the cleverest speeches. They are often the people who already had claims denominated in something else before everyone started running for the exit. This is what wealthy families in unstable countries have understood for a very long time. They keep money in dollars, or in Swiss francs, or in foreign real estate, or in offshore structures, or in securities tied to more stable jurisdictions. They do not do that because it is fashionable. They do it because if the local currency is where the damage concentrates, then the first defense is not to hold everything inside the blast zone. Ordinary middle-class savers often fail here because they assume loyalty, convenience, or normalcy should keep everything local. Their income is local, their bank is local, their pension is local, their property is local, their bond fund is local, their political assumptions are local. Then if the local currency breaks, they are not merely losing on one front. They are losing everywhere at once. That is not diversification. That is concentration disguised as ordinary life. The rich family with a dollar account in Miami during a Latin American currency collapse was not performing sophistication. It was simply standing outside the immediate collapse of the local unit. The school teacher with 30 years of peso savings was standing inside it. One group watched the fire. The other breathed the smoke. This is also why governments impose capital controls once crises accelerate. They are not doing that because the system is strong. They do it because too many people have begun to understand that exit itself has value. When the government starts locking doors, it is because too many citizens have started walking toward them. Now, let me be clear. I am not telling ordinary people to build style offshore empires. I am saying that any household which keeps every significant claim inside one jurisdiction, one currency, one tax regime, and one political promise is taking a larger risk than it realizes. Reasonable foreign exposure, foreign currency assets, globally diversified securities, and claims outside a single local system can all serve the same deeper purpose. They reduce the chance that one failing unit takes your whole world with it. That is not disloyalty. That is prudence. The fifth survivor is real estate, though not in the lazy way people talk about it. People love property for the wrong reasons. They love that prices go up on screens. They love leverage. They love neighborhood bragging rights. They love the social prestige of visible ownership. That is not what makes real estate resilient in a currency problem. The real strength of well-positioned real estate is much simpler. It is a physical thing with utility. People need places to live. Businesses need places to operate. Replacement costs rise when the currency falls because labor, materials, permits, land, and the effort of rebuilding do not stay politely still while money is collapsing. So when a building still stands after the currency regime changes, the owner has something real left. Not because the number in the old currency was flattering, because the structure remains useful in the new one. That is exactly what happened in Weimar Germany. Apartment owners saw nominal prices become ridiculous. Then a new currency regime eventually arrived. The people holding bank balances had been ruined by the transition. The people holding useful buildings still had useful buildings in post-Soviet Russia. The same pattern emerged. Ruble claims evaporated in meaning. Apartments remained apartments. But again, I must add a discipline point because laziness always waits nearby. Not all real estate is a crisis asset. An over-leveraged speculative condo in the wrong market is not the same thing as a modest, desirable, useful property held with sane debt or no debt. A building can survive a currency crisis and still bankrupt a foolish owner if the financing structure is wrong. Leverage turns a durable asset into a fragile ownership claim. That distinction matters immensely. This is why I always return to the same principle. Survival depends not only on what you own, but on how you own it. A good asset owned stupidly can still sink you. A modest asset owned wisely can save you. The sixth survivor is the one that almost no one wants to discuss, because it does not sit neatly in a brokerage statement. Skill, real skill, useful skill, transferable skill, a person who can repair engines, treat illness, grow food, solve technical problems, fix electrical systems, weld, code, build, negotiate, sell, diagnose, or otherwise do something that remains necessary in stress conditions is holding a type of capital that no central bank can dilute. I do not mean motivational poster nonsense about investing in yourself. I mean the simple economic reality that in a damaged monetary system, the person with an essential skill can reprice his labor in real time, often more effectively than a salaried worker trapped in fixed compensation. Look at Hungary in 1946, where prices doubled with absurd speed. Factory wages had to be adjusted constantly. Government salaries got mauled, but a person with a scarce useful trade could demand payment in goods, in foreign notes, in gold, or in whatever else the local market still respected. That is not a small point. A useful skill is a form of portable sovereignty. It requires no warehouse. It requires no vault. It cannot be inflated away. It can be taxed, obstructed, regulated, underpaid, or misused. Yes, but it cannot be conjured into existence by policymakers at the speed with which they can create more paper. That makes it unusually durable. I sometimes think people misunderstand what the rich really pass on to their children. They imagine the answer is only money. Sometimes the more powerful inheritance is competence. If a child grows into adulthood knowing how to solve useful problems, price his work, maintain discipline, and negotiate from value rather than desperation, he is carrying one of the finest forms of crisis-resistant capital there is. This is why I never tire of reading, thinking, learning, and refining judgment. Skill compounds too. In some environments, it compounds even more reliably than financial capital, because it travels with you. So now step back and look at the shape of all 6 survivors. Productive land, gold. Businesses with pricing power. Foreign currency and foreign claims, useful real estate. Essential skills. They do not all look alike, but they share something profound. They derive value from utility, scarcity, trust, or human necessity outside the immediate health of a single fiat currency. That is why they keep surviving. A bushel of wheat feeds regardless of the regime. An ounce of gold remains scarce, regardless of the central bank. A dominant utility or essential consumer business can reprice, regardless of political speeches. A foreign claim retains value if the home unit fails. A livable building still shelters. A skilled pair of hands still solves a problem. Now consider the things that tend to be destroyed. Savings accounts denominated in the failing currency, government bonds denominated in the failing currency, pensions fixed to the failing currency, cash balances sitting passively while inflation chews the real value away, long-term fixed income streams with no repricing mechanism. Those are the assets the public calls responsible. And under normal conditions, some of them are entirely sensible. That is why the subject is uncomfortable. The things that betray people in crises are not always foolish in calm periods. They become dangerous when they are held with no appreciation for the environment around them. That is why I do not speak in absolutes. I do not tell ordinary people to abandon all bank balances, all bonds, all local claims, all pension structures, and live entirely in some theatrical fortress of land, metal, and canned goods. That would be foolish. What I do say is this: if every meaningful part of your financial life lives inside the same paper promise, you have not diversified. You have concentrated. If every significant claim you own depends on the continued trustworthiness of one government, issued currency, you are not safe. You are obedient. There is a difference. And a rational person should care very much about that difference. Now, people always want the same follow. Up, are you predicting imminent collapse? No, I do not waste my life on theatrical prediction. Prediction with false precision flatters the ego and usually weakens the judgment. I care more about structure than prophecy. You do not need to know the month of the next monetary crisis to prepare sensibly for the reality that paper systems are less permanent than the public prefers to believe. You do not need to scream that the dollar dies tomorrow to acknowledge that the dollar has already lost almost all of its original purchasing power over a long enough span. You do not need to become a bunker mystic to accept that every fiat system in history has either collapsed outright or been steadily thinned until the old unit became a ghost of its former self. That is simply the pattern. The pattern is what interests me. Not because patterns allow certainty, because patterns allow intelligent preparation. If you know what has survived repeatedly, then you can start asking more useful questions about your own life. How much of my net worth is trapped inside claims that can only survive if my home currency stays trustworthy? How much real productive ownership do I have? How much pricing power do the businesses I own possess? How much of my liquidity lives under one banking regime? How much useful skill have I built? How much of my portfolio depends entirely on the continuation of present political and monetary assumptions? These are good questions, and asking them is already an act of intelligence, because most people refuse to ask them at all. They prefer normality. Normality is dangerous when it becomes a sedative. The whole challenge of money is that the social world rewards behavior that looks stable even when it is structurally fragile. That is why the banker in Berlin appeared safer than the farmer outside the city. One man fit the story of civilization, the other fit the story of labor. Then the currency changed and civilization began valuing different things. I do not want to be the man holding the most socially approved asset on the eve of a regime that stops rewarding approval. I want to be the man holding things that still matter. Once approval becomes meaningless, that does not require panic. It requires honesty. Honesty about what money is. Money is a claim. If the claim weakens, you had better own other things. Besides the claim, this is one reason I have always preferred productive businesses over paper promises. A great business can adapt. It can reprice. It can widen margins. It can own hard assets. It can retain relevance, while the unit of account degrades. A bond denominated in a weakening currency cannot do any of those things. It simply continues being what it was promised to be while the value of the promise itself changes underneath it. That is not an attractive form of safety to me. There is another important practical point. Most people think protection must mean extremism. It does not. You do not need to allocate everything into one dramatic answer. That is another mistake. The goal is resilience, not theatrical purity. A household can sensibly hold ordinary working cash, retirement assets, quality equities, some foreign exposure, useful reserves, and perhaps some monetary insurance without turning life into a strange ideological performance. The aim is not to declare war on modern finance. The aim is to stop pretending that modern finance has repealed the ancient laws of trust, scarcity, utility, and confidence. It has not. And those ancient laws come back to the front whenever the paper system is stressed. That is why I think a sane person should want at least some claim on real things, some exposure to productive ownership, some independence from a single currency, some skill that remains valuable when social structures become less smooth, some recognition that pensions, bonds, and bank balances are not sacred shields. They are conditional claims inside a system that has historically failed many times in many places. Once you understand that, you do not become hysterical. You become harder to fool. And being hard to fool is one of the highest financial virtues I know. It protects you not only from manias, but from the much quieter danger of administrative decay. A currency can fall by policy, by inflation, by neglect, by debt management, by repression, or by simple long erosion. The end result for the saver is the same, if he never diversified away from the promise itself. That is the lesson history keeps teaching. It taught it in Germany, it taught it in France, it taught it in Latin America, it taught it in Eastern Europe, it taught it in Africa. It is teaching it more softly even now in developed countries, where people still imagine gradual erosion is somehow not the same story because it does not arrive with wheelbarrows. It is the same story, only slower. So if I were speaking to someone trying to protect a lifetime of effort, I would not ask him first what return he wants. I would ask him what he believes about the permanence of paper promises. Then I would ask what fraction of his life depends entirely on those promises holding. Then I would ask what real things he owns. Land that produces, businesses that can reprice, real estate that remains useful, claims denominated beyond one currency, skill that travels with him, monetary insurance outside policy whim. These are not glamorous questions. That is why they are so profitable. The world overpays for glamour and underpays for survival. I prefer the second. I always have. Because if the next crisis arrives, and history says one will, the crowd will not care what clever opinions you held last year. It will matter what you held when trust began to fail. That is the whole point. A crisis does not ask what you knew, it asks what you own. And if the answer is only the same paper claims everyone else trusted because everyone else trusted them, then you may discover too late that social approval was never the same thing as security. I would rather know that now, and I would rather structure accordingly. That in the end is what prudent investing really is, not pretending you can forecast every event. Understanding what tends to survive when the familiar promises no longer do.